Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf's YouTube channel. Today, we embark on a profound exploration of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your unwavering support holds immeasurable significance for us. We humbly request you to like and share this audiobook, extending its reach and opening the door to wisdom for more individuals. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to receive immediate updates on our latest content. Let's unite to disseminate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, forging a community devoted to enlightenment and inner serenity. We extend our heartfelt gratitude for your active participation in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible. For your convenience, we've included a video playlist in the video description. Now, let's commence with today's reading. Delight. July 15, 2021. With a lot of the pleasures of the world, the real pleasure is not so much in the pleasure itself, but in the delight we take in it. Anticipating how good it's going to be and, after it's done, talking to ourselves about how great it was. This is our way of encouraging ourselves to look for it again. This delight, as the Buddha said, usually is one of the accompaniments of craving. It's what nourishes craving. And in most cases, craving is a bad thing. It leads to suffering. We delight in things that really don't have much true happiness to offer. But the delight is all in the way we dress them up. Like that dog that visits us every now and then, the one that wears sunglasses and little outfits. A lot of the owner's pleasure is in the outfits and the sunglasses. This, the Buddha said, is the reason why we fall for things that don't actually give us much satisfaction. But we can learn how to delight in good things, too. After all, when you're getting started on the path, you need something to encourage you. Craving and desire are part of our motivation. We want to put an end to suffering. So you have to learn how to feed that desire, to keep it going. The Buddha lists 6 kinds of skillful delight that really are worth cultivating as part of the path. He says that as you engage in these kinds of delight, you gain happiness in the here and now, simply anticipating how good it's going to be as you practice the path, and as you reach the end of the path. This delight is also what provides the nourishment for staying on the path. The first in the list is delight in the Dhamma, the fact that there's a Dhamma teaching us that there is an end of suffering, and that it can be attained through human effort. This Dhamma explains how we suffer, why we suffer. It explains the big issues of life: aging, illness, death, separation. It gives reliable guidance in how to act, how to speak, how to think. It reassures us that the effort put into developing skillful actions is well spent. It basically lays things out, and in an honorable way. As the Buddha said, it's admirable in the beginning, admirable in the middle, admirable in the end. In other words, the words of the Dhamma are inspiring. The practice is a noble practice, one in which we engage in developing the noble qualities of our own minds. And the end result is total freedom from suffering of any kind, freedom from restrictions of any kind. It's a good Dhamma. So we can take delight in that. There's that conversation the Buddha had with the Asura who talked about how the Asuras take delight in the ocean, which has many marvelous qualities. They look at the Dhamma and Vinaya of the Buddha, and notice that it had many analogous marvelous qualities as well. So when your practice begins to flag, remind yourself that you've got a good road map here, the most reliable one there is. It's been tested for more than 2,000 years. It deals with the big issues in life, issues that are not specific to any race, class, nation, or culture. It not only presents the issues, but also solves them in a skillful and honorable way, pointing to a happiness that's free from aging, free from illness, free from death. Take delight in that. The next 2 types of delight are delight in developing and delight in abandoning. In other words, developing skillful qualities and abandoning unskillful ones. The Buddha recommends this from the very beginning of the path, as in his instructions to Rahula, when he says that you should try to act only on skillful intentions. When you look at your actions and can see that they actually are harmless, you take delight in that. That delight should provide you with energy to keep on practicing to get better and better at training the mind. Ajahn Mahabua talks about taking delight in seeing little flakes of defilement getting peeled off the mind, like flakes of bark peeled off a tree. In other words, regard it as a victory each time you're able to say no to a desire that you know is unskillful, or to say no to a mind state that's unskillful to figure out why you would be inclined to go there, and then to see through it to the point where you realize you don't want to go there anymore. The next delight is delight in seclusion. Enjoying being alone. It's interesting that the Pali Canon portrays Ven. Mahakassapa as being strict and stern, yet he's got a wonderful poem where he talks about how great it is to be out in the beauties of the wilderness. This was back in the days when wilderness wasn't appreciated as a beautiful place. When people wrote poetry about the beauty of nature, they were usually talking about domesticated nature. The oldest wilderness poetry we have is in the Pali Canon. It talks about the delight that comes from just being out in the wilds where there's nobody else around. Think about the Buddha's story of the elephant. When it lived with its herd, it would go down to drink the water, but everybody else in the herd had already gone down and played in the water and made it muddy. When the herd went down to bathe, the other elephants would knock into him. So he decided to go off and live alone. Living alone, he had clean water. When he went down to bathe, there was nobody knocking into him. When he felt an itch, he would take a branch and scratch himself. The Buddha makes a comparison with a meditator out alone in the forest. You look around, and there's nobody to interfere with you, nobody to harass you, nobody to take up your time. You get into jhana as the branch with which you scratch yourself, and with which you find a pleasure that's really gratifying, a pleasure that you can't get when you're embroiled with people. So appreciate that. And note that the seclusion being discussed here is not just physical seclusion. It's also mental seclusion. When the mind is secluded from unskillful states, it can settle down with a sense of inner ease. Uninterrupted, smooth, steady. Learn to appreciate that. Learn to delight in that. The last two kinds of delight are delight in the non-afflicted and delight in non-objectification. These are two names for nibbana, or two aspects of nibbana, but they also describe ways in which you practice. As you practice, you're not afflicting anybody. You're observing the precepts, finding pleasure in getting the mind concentrated, using your discernment to get past your defilements. You're practicing non-affliction even as you're headed toward the ultimate state of non-affliction. The same with non-objectification. Objectification is when you start with the idea, I am the thinker, and then from there you identify yourself as a being that needs to feed, that needs a certain part of the world to feed on, whether it's a physical part of the world or part of the world of ideas. You stake your claim and then you have to fight off other people. As the Buddha said, objectification is the kind of thinking that leads to conflict. So instead, you think in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Simply, what is suffering? What is the cause of suffering? What is the cessation of suffering? What is the path to the cessation? In other words, you think in terms that have nothing to do with becoming a self or a world and that cut through the processes of becoming. And you find that there's no conflict. You can delight in that. As you take these different kinds of delight, they give you the energy you need in order to practice. You're doing a good thing. You've got a good roadmap. You're following it. And you see it has a good impact on you and the people around you. These 6 kinds of delight can also counteract types of delight that are genuinely unskillful. Delighting in the Dhamma counteracts the delight some people take in the idea that there's really nothing explained in the world. It's all a big mystery. There's no true right or wrong. It's all a matter of different people's opinions, with some people trying to force their ideas of right and wrong on other people. Of course, if you take that attitude, you give your defilements wide range to roam around in. After all, if good and bad are simply social constructs, you're free to say no to any social construct. Nobody can say that you're wrong, because if they say that you're wrong, it's just a social construct, too. If you leave the processes of birth and death as a mystery, then you don't know what to do. And when you don't know what to do, your defilements can move in and take over. So delight in the Dhamma helps to counteract those attitudes, some of which have become part of modern Buddhism, sad to say. But if you really delight in the Dhamma, it gives you reason to put them aside. Similarly with delighting in abandoning and delighting in developing. The mind that doesn't delight in developing skillful qualities or abandoning unskillful ones is a mind that's heedless. And there's part of the mind that likes being heedless, the part that likes to say, I don't care what happens down the line. I want what I want right now. I don't want to have to think about things in the future. It gets in the way of my enjoying the present. If you have no sense of shame, no sense of compunction, that's a mind that leaves you unguarded, unprotected, easy prey for your defilements. When you delight in developing skillful qualities, it fights against those careless, heedless attitudes. When you delight in abandoning unskillful ones, you're basically saying, I've been a friend to craving for a long time. I've taken craving as my friend, but now I realize that unskillful craving is not a true friend. I'll be more selective in who I choose as my friends, take as my examples. When you delight in seclusion, that counteracts, of course, your delight in getting entangled with other people. When you get entangled with other people, as the Buddha said, it's hard for you to find time to settle down with the establishings of mindfulness, to get a proper object for the mind to find the happiness, the well-being that can come when the mind gets concentrated. So learn how to delight in seclusion. Even when you haven't yet developed deep concentration, the fact that you learn how to like being alone will incline the mind in the right direction. It opens the possibilities that get closed off when you're constantly dealing with other people, entangled with other people. To delight in the non-afflicted helps overcome the part of the mind that likes to exert power over other people, the one that doesn't care how much other people suffer or how much you have to struggle with them, as long as you can get them to do what you want. Delighting in non-objectification helps to counteract the side of the mind that delights in conflict, that likes taking a stance to lay claim to things and fight other people off. Given that the mind does have these unskillful types of delight, you've got to fight them with skillful delight. You can't just tell yourself, well, the Buddha teaches us to be equanimous about all things, so try to clone that equanimous attitude about your defilements, too. That doesn't give you much strength. The desire to stick with the path needs to be nourished. You need to learn how to talk to yourself about what a good path this is. Ultimately, it'll take you to a state that doesn't require any talking or elaboration, any embroidery. That's what's so good about Nibbana. It doesn't require a review. It doesn't require a critique. It doesn't require your talking about it all the time. It's just there, and you know that it's good in and of itself. The Ajahns talk about this a lot. How Nibbana doesn't require any chatter, doesn't require any praise. It's good in and of itself. The practice takes you to the point where you don't need to delight in things, and you don't miss the activity of taking delight. It's that good. But just as the end of conceit requires a certain amount of conceit to get there, and the end of craving requires a certain amount of craving, so too the end of delight requires that you learn how to take skillful delight in the path to give you the energy to keep you on the path, and to find a sense of well-being while you're there, so that you have the strength to follow it all the way through. Pull yourself up by your fetters. December 1, 2020. Ajahn Lee often makes the point that people who have studied a lot of Dhamma, when they come to the practice, want to let go of things too quickly, things they actually need to hold on to. They know that at some point on the path they're going to have to let them go, so why not let them go right away? He talks about how craving can actually be good. We know that it's the cause of suffering, and that someday we're going to have to abandon all forms of craving. But, as he points out, if you don't have any desire, and the words craving and desire basically cover the same thing in Pali, if you don't have the desire, you don't have the craving to practice, the path is not going to happen. Similarly with the three characteristics. Everybody hears about things being inconstant, stressful, and not self, so they want to let go of the 5 aggregates right away. But we need to hold on to the 5 aggregates in order to develop the path. The things that are stressful, you learn how to make easeful. The things that are inconstant, you learn how to make constant. The things that are not yours, you learn to bring under your control, at least to some extent. It's only when you've pushed against these three characteristics that you can actually find out exactly where they are. You push against them by developing the path, getting the mind into concentration. And it's something you hold on to while you're developing it. While you're sitting here, hold on to the breath. The image that they give in the forest tradition is of a red ant. They have these big red ants in Thailand that live up in mango trees. If people climb up in a mango tree to get mangoes, the red ants bite them. And they bite hard, so hard that if you try to pull them off, sometimes the head detaches from the body, and yet the jaws are still holding on. So hold on to your breath with the tenacity of a red ant. There will come a point where you let it go, but you're not going to get to that point unless you hold on first. The same principle applies even to some of the fetters. The canon lists 5 higher fetters: passion for form, passion for formlessness, restlessness, conceit, and ignorance. Of the 5, only ignorance really has no role to play in the path, although Ajahn Lee says that even ignorance has its good side. Once you know you're ignorant, that gives you the motivation to want to find knowledge. But ignorance itself doesn't help. You've got to know the 4 noble truths from the very beginning to get a sense of what the landscape is and what you've got to do. But the other 4 fetters have their good points. They're actually useful. You don't let them go until you've gotten some use out of them. For instance, with conceit, the sense that I am. We're not talking about the conceit of pride, but simply the idea that I am. I know some people who say that when you're working with karma, you've got to realize that your intentions are simply the result of causes and conditions. They don't have anything to do with you. But that doesn't give you any motivation to try to make skillful choices. Those people say you have to let go of every sense of I because it causes you trouble. Well, it's actually necessary for certain skillful decisions. Their approach is like putting up a ladder on the side of your house, cutting out all the rungs, and saying, "Okay, float up to the roof." If you cut out the rungs, the 2 sides just fall apart. You have no way of getting up at all. There are some things you've got to hold on to first. Passion for form is what gets you into right concentration. The Buddha himself says that if you don't have the pleasure that comes from the first jhana or better, then no matter how much you know about the drawbacks of sensuality, you're not going to be able to let it go. You're going to keep coming back. So to overcome sensual passion, you have to develop passion for form. Similarly with a passion for formlessness, the dimensions of the infinitude of space, the infinitude of consciousness, the dimension of nothingness, the dimension of neither perception or non-perception, are levels of concentration you can get into because you enjoy them. There's delight there, passion, desire, delight. Granted, these are fetters. Think of them as chains. Some chains you can actually use to pull yourself up. Say you're at the bottom of a well, and you have a chain in your hand. You toss it up, get it wrapped around a bar or a tree branch above the well, and then you can pull yourself up with the chain. When you don't need the chain anymore, then you let it go. Similarly with conceit and restlessness. Restlessness is the sense that there's more work to be done. If you don't have that sense of restlessness, you're not going to do the work. That together with your sense of self, the sense of I am, those are really useful for making progress on the path. I've heard some people say that the approach of the path is to put the mind at ease. Will it to rest in a state of equanimity? Will it into a state of patience and acceptance? But there's very little thinking that goes into that. In fact, it actively discourages any attempt to think or to figure things out. But that's not the kind of person the Buddha was. The Buddha was very inquisitive. He wanted to figure things out. Precisely how do you act in a way that's going to give good results? And what are the choices available to you when you act? When you make a choice, what's happening there? Do you have the freedom to choose? The Buddha assumed freedom as part of the path. The types of teachings that said we have no freedom of choice at all because everything is totally predetermined, those were not among the options he even tried to explore. For one thing, you can't explore that principle. How can you test something like powerlessness? He wanted to explore freedom of choice. How far can it go? If you don't have a sense of yourself as wanting to make progress, you won't put in the work. That's where conceit functions on this level. Think of what the Buddha said about renunciate distress. It's what you need to get yourself out of ordinary householder distress. You think about the fact that there's a state of peace that others have found, but you're not there yet. That realization, even though it's a little bit painful and not at all easeful, does make you inquisitive. It motivates you to follow the path. That renunciate distress is a combination of restlessness and conceit, and it's what makes you look at the spot in the mind where there is freedom of choice. How does that happen? There are causes and conditions. But as the Buddha said, sometimes there's a cause that comes together with the effect, and then it disappears together with the effect. In the present moment, there's a freedom to choose causes like that. If we can't assume that, then there's no sense in a path of practice at all. But what is that freedom? Where is it? How can we take advantage of it? That's the big point. How can we take advantage of it? The more you explore it, the more you hover and circle around this point, the sooner you'll ultimately find that it does lead you to a different kind of freedom entirely. It's like going through a black hole into another universe, but one that's a totally different dimension, outside of space, outside of time. It's there. Notice that voice that keeps trying to make choices. What next? What next? The assumption of the mind that has that constant, what next, what next, what to do next, does assume freedom, freedom to choose what to do. If it didn't assume freedom, it wouldn't ask the question. That's the whole point. We're asking questions as we practice. And any teaching that discourages questions, especially questions about what's skillful and what's not, has to be put aside. It's not helpful at all. Our motivation for wanting to ask those questions is the sense that something's wrong. There still is suffering. There still is stress. Even if it's very subtle, there's still stress. And I want out. That combination of restlessness and conceit is what forces you to ask the questions, and it's going to give you the answers. So even though these things are fetters, passion for form, for formlessness, conceit, and restlessness, they're the type of chains, as I said, that you can actually use to pull yourself out of the well. Then when you're out, you don't need the chains anymore. You can let them go. As you read the Dhamma and try to apply it to your own practice, remember that some things are good across the board, and some things are useless across the board. But then there are some things that are going to have their uses sometimes, and have to be put away at others. Learn how to recognize them and get the most out of them. See how far you can take them and they can take you before you throw them away. Grasping the snake. July 17, 2020. There are passages where the Buddha teaches the relinquishing of all views. There are passages where he advocates right view. There are passages where he argues with people about right and wrong view, and a couple where he actually seeks people out to question them about their wrong views. So what's going on? I think a lot of it has to do with how we hold the view and what the view is designed to do. Some views are designed simply for the sake of argumentation. You take the position that the world is eternal, and what are you going to do with that view? You can get into arguments with people who say that it's not, that it was created by a creator God or whatever. That's the kind of view that issues only in arguments. There are other views, though, that can be used to put an end to suffering, and those are the ones the Buddha recommends as right view. Even there, though, it's possible to use them to get into arguments. Think of the image of the snake. If you grasp the snake wrongly, say, by the tail, it's going to bite you. But the Buddha doesn't say not to grasp the snake at all. After all, the snake may have some venom that can be used for making anti-venom. So you learn how to grasp it rightly. You take a forked stick, pin it down right behind the head, and then no matter how much the snake may writhe around your arm, you can hold it safely. You get the use out of it that you want. So it's not that we don't hold to views at all. After all, how could you function if you didn't hold to views? Why would you talk? If there were no right and no wrong, what would be the purpose of talking? But you have to ask yourself, right for what purpose or wrong for what purpose? When you can answer that question, you can get somewhere with your views. The Buddha's views are not designed for argumentation. They actually focus to a great extent on qualities in the mind, just looking at what your mind is doing right here, right now. They're right for putting an end to suffering if you keep this focus in mind. Think of the wings to awakening. 7 lists of dhammas that are useful for the practice, different ways of looking at the practice. You've got the 4 establishings of mindfulness, the 4 right exertions, the 4 bases for success, the 5 strengths, the 5 faculties, the 7 factors for awakening, the Noble Eightfold Path. They're almost all exclusively lists of mental qualities. Now, that kind of view, you can put to use. You can look at the lists and learn some important things about how the mind functions. One is that the 4 main factors of the path, which appear again and again in the lists, are effort, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. These are the qualities we have to develop within ourselves. The different lists differ in the order with which they place these qualities. Sometimes you start with discernment, and you use that to develop concentration. Sometimes the concentration comes first, and then the discernment comes later. It's the same with mindfulness. Sometimes mindfulness comes after discernment and sometimes before, which means in the practice that the causal influence can go either way. With each of these 2 pairs, mindfulness and discernment, or concentration and discernment, each side of the pair helps the other side along. As your mindfulness gets better, your discernment gets more expansive because you can remember more things from what you've learned in the path. As your discernment gets better, it provides more useful things for mindfulness to keep in mind. The same with concentration. The more you get the mind firmly established, the more your discernment is going to see. But to get it established requires that you understand the mind at least to some extent. However, it's interesting to notice that in all the various ways in which the Buddha lists these faculties, effort and mindfulness both come before concentration always. So as you're trying to get the mind to settle down, remember it's not going to just happen on its own. There will be times when the mind seems to settle down spontaneously, but that's because the conditions are right, and you can just plunk right down. But if you're going to wait for the conditions to be right, it's like waiting for the weather to be right. It's totally beyond your control. You're trying to develop a skill here, which means that you look at the qualities coming up in the mind, not only while you sit here with your eyes closed, but also as you go through the day. To what extent do you allow anger to come in and take charge? To what extent do you allow greed to come in, or feelings of being slighted, or of not being respected? Those feelings, the Buddha said, come under restlessness and anxiety, which are hindrances. So as you go through the day, watch out for them. If they're allowed to take root in the course of the day, they're going to be here, rooted in the mind, when you sit down to meditate. You've got to be very careful. Meditation is an all-day process. The effort goes in all the time. Now, effort doesn't mean that you have to walk long hours of walking meditation or sit long hours of sitting meditation every day. It means, though, that you have to keep watch over your mind at all times. The person meditating and the person working in the kitchen, the person meditating and the person working in the orchard. They're all the same person. Qualities that are allowed to establish themselves in the mind in the kitchen or the orchard don't automatically go away when you sit down to meditate. They're right there, established. They're going to get in the way. So, remember, there's an effort that is to be carried out all the way through the day. There's the effort to prevent unskillful qualities from arising. In other words, if you know that you have certain bad habits, you make a point to be especially on the lookout for them. Then do what you can to think in new ways. If you have a problem with anger, think in ways that will undercut the anger. Actively develop new thought patterns in the mind, so that when an angry thought comes up and you know the kind of conversation the mind has with itself, when it's angry you have an antidote ready. If anger does come into the mind, use the antidote to get rid of it. At other times, think in the terms that would undercut the anger before it can come. It's the same with skillful qualities. What can you do to be more mindful? What can you do to be more compassionate and have more goodwill? Actively think these thoughts. All too often, we think of meditation as not thinking. It may feel artificial to go around thinking thoughts of goodwill all the time, but it's a useful exercise. Artificial and natural are adjectives you can put out of your mind for the time being. Training the mind is artificial. Every effort is artificial. They're the products of artifice. Now, some efforts come more easily than others, but that's because they're more habitual, that's all. Here you're trying to make right effort habitual. The same with right mindfulness. Try to go through the day rooted in the body, rooted in the breath. The lessons you learn as you try to keep the mind under control as you're rooted in the breath will be there in the breath. They'll be right there, available so that when you sit down to meditate and you get focused on the breath, a lot of good associations will come along with the breath. You'll be ready to practice and get the mind to settle down. Right effort and right mindfulness are the qualities we need to develop in order to get the mind into right concentration. We use discernment in order to foster them. We need to have right view about right effort, along with right view about right mindfulness. We keep reminding ourselves that this is a really worthy activity we're engaged in. Then, as we engage in these activities, our right views become more precise. The Buddha talks about 3 kinds of discernment. There's the discernment that comes from listening and the discernment that comes from thinking things through, but then there's also the discernment that comes from developing good qualities through the practice. You can listen to the Dhamma, and you get right view on the level of listening. That points you to the practice. You can think things through as you come up with difficulties in the practice. But the developing is what really gets the discernment going. It makes it yours. Otherwise, you're just borrowing other people's discernment. As long as you're in a position where you have to borrow somebody else's discernment, at least borrow the Buddha's. But ultimately, you want to get to the position where you can produce your own. You can depend on it. It really has been tested and fine-honed by your practice. That's when it's really yours. And paradoxically, once it's really yours, that's when you begin to let it go. But you can still use it. After all, after the Buddha's awakening, even though he said there was nothing in him that was fastened to any views, he still taught right view. And he still went out and argued with people who taught wrong view, especially the wrong view concerning action. So it's a question of learning how to hold to the views. If you learn how to hold skillfully, then you can get a lot of use out of them. If you hold them wrongly, they bite. So find that forked stick, the attitude that you're going to use the views for the right purpose, and that'll keep you safe. Fix your views. October 27, 2021. There's a line in the Karaniya Metta Sutta that's sometimes translated as not holding to fixed views. I've been tempted to take that translation and send it in to the people who collect fake Buddhist quotes, because the word fix doesn't appear in the passage. There's no place where the Buddha says fixed views are bad in and of themselves. There's right view and there's wrong view, but it's not the case that wrong view is fixed, and right view is not fixed. The difference lies elsewhere. After all, one of the adjectives for describing people who have attained a stream is that they've become consummate in view. They've seen that the 4 Noble Truths really are true. Their confidence and conviction in the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha have been confirmed. That's the point where their view really is right. Of course, you don't stop there. You learn how to use right view properly to take you even further, from right view to right knowledge. What this means in practice is that, as we're starting out, our views are not quite right yet. We have a general idea. The Buddha talks about the 4 Noble Truths. He talks about the basic teaching that skillful qualities should be developed, and unskillful ones should be abandoned. Those are categorical truths, in other words, true across the board. There's never any place where the Buddha defines suffering, say, in other terms aside from the 5 clinging aggregates. He never says that they're the end of suffering. There's no place where he defines right resolve, say, as being resolved on sensuality. Certain things are right and certain things are wrong, period, across the board. And even though we're coming from ignorance, when we start on the path we have some idea of where the line is drawn between right and wrong, and we use that. Then, with practice, we refine our understanding of where the line is. So in that sense, we don't want to hold to our earlier understanding of right views. After all, right views are meant to be used, and as they're used they get further refined. Remember what the Four Noble Truths have to say about right view. It's interesting. The Four Noble Truths are right view, but they also stand outside right view to describe the position of right view as part of the path, in other words, something to be developed. As you develop right view, it's meant to develop right resolve, right speech, right action, all the way through right concentration. These are views that are meant to be used, and as you use them you get to know them better. That's one way of knowing that your views are right. You know the right use for them and actually use them that way. Then, as you begin to get results, you find that as you develop the path it does lead to something deathless. That's when your right view has been confirmed. It doesn't change from that point on. It's fixed. Now again, the Buddha himself has gone beyond right view, but when he's teaching right view to others, it's always the same. So in that sense, it's fixed. The same with the principle of developing skillful qualities and abandoning unskillful ones. His teachings on those points are always consistent. As for some of his other teachings, they have their time and place. There was a young monk one time who was asked by a member of another sect, "What is the result of action?" And the young monk answered, "The result of action is stress, dukkha." The person asking the question said, "That's the first time I've ever heard a Buddhist monk say that. You'd better go check that with the Buddha." So first he talks to Ven. Ananda, and then Ven. Ananda takes him to see the Buddha. Another monk is listening in as they talk. When the Buddha rebukes the first monk for having said that all action leads to stress, the monk listening in says, maybe he was thinking of the fact that action leads to feeling, and all feelings are stressful. The Buddha replies that that's not the time to use that teaching. When you're asked about action, you talk about the three kinds of feeling: pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain, the purpose being to point out that skillful actions lead to pleasure, and unskillful ones to pain. That way, you can motivate your listener to act on skillful intentions. It's not the time to point out that even pleasant feelings, on one level, are painful, for then the listener would have no motivation to act on skillful intentions at all. So the teaching on all fabricated things being stressful may always be true, but it's not always useful. It's not always right for the context. Then, of course, there are the many teachings on taking yourself as your mainstay, using yourself as your governing principle. If you try to bring in the teaching on not self and say, well, everything's supposed to be not self, so how can you use the self as a mainstay or a governing principle? That would be bringing the teaching of not self in at the wrong time, the wrong place. You have to understand the teachings of the three characteristics, or the three perceptions, in the context of the duties of the Four Noble Truths. They're appropriate and useful for abandoning your craving and for comprehending your clinging. But when you're trying to develop a path, you use those perceptions only on things that would pull you off the path. You don't tell yourself, concentration is inconstant, concentration is stressful, concentration is not self, therefore I let go of it. That's true on one level, but it's not right when you still need to develop concentration. That's not the time to use it. So this is one area where you want to make sure that your views are not fixed, in the sense of trying to apply a teaching across the board, when it's not meant to be applied across the board. There was a modern monk one time who, after reading about emptiness, told his mother, "The Dhamma teaches that you're not really my mother, because there's really nobody there." His mother looked at him and said, "Well, if anybody knows whether I'm your mother, it's me." They don't know. She was the one who was right at that point. It's a matter of knowing the right time and the right place with teachings like that. As for the Four Noble Truths, they are true across the board, and they don't change. That's one of the meanings of the word noble, noble in the sense of being universal. These truths are true for everybody everywhere. They're true not only in India, or only in one part of India, or at one point in time. They're true all through time, all through space. In that sense they're fixed. It's your relationship to them that you have to watch out for, especially as you're getting started on the path. You have to keep reminding yourself, Right view is not to be used to beat other people over the head. It's meant to help you understand where you need to look to see your own ignorance and what you need to do in order to see it clearly. You develop mindfulness, you develop alertness, so that you can gain clear knowledge. Because this is the big problem. We're trying to battle ignorance, but where are we coming from? We're coming from ignorance ourselves. There are times along the path where it seems like the blind are leading the blind, but fortunately there is a part of the mind that has some clarity. That's what the Buddha meant when he said that the mind is luminous, it can watch itself and see clearly what it's doing. So you apply your understanding of what the Four Noble Truths are, particularly when you're developing the path, and you really commit to it. Then you reflect, am I getting the results I want? If I'm not, is the problem with the path or is the problem with me, my understanding of the path? In the beginning, you go on the assumption that your understanding is the problem. So you look again, act again, look again. Remember what the Buddha said about how the Dhamma is developed? Through commitment and reflection. You commit to doing it as well as you can, and then you reflect on what you're doing. Then you make adjustments. That way, by observing your actions, you begin to cut through a lot of your ignorance. You're not just reflecting in general terms. You're using reflection together with commitment, watching yourself in action. That's how you arrive at views that really are certain. In fact, that's one of the adjectives used to describe people who have attained the stream. They're niyata, they're certain. Their right view is certain, and their future is certain. They're going to gain awakening for sure. That much is fixed. So try to have a clear sense, when the Buddha's talking about right view, of which things are true and right across the board, which things are true but right only at certain times, certain stages of the practice. And be alive to the fact that as long as you haven't yet attained the first taste of the deathless, or you haven't gained a Dhamma eye, your views still need work. But you don't work on them by theorizing or simply being fluid in what you think. You work on them by committing to what you understand the path to be, and then reflecting. This quality of the reflection is going to carry you all the way through. If you don't learn how to reflect on what you're doing, you're going to miss a lot of things. Like that person who said in a letter to Ajahn Fuang that he was practicing seeing everything as inconstant, stressful, not self. He watched TV, he engaged in all of his daily activities, trying to see all things as stressful, inconstant, and not self. Ajahn Fuang told me to write back to him and say, those things are not the problem. The problem is, who is it that's telling them that they're inconstant, stressful, not self? Look at that. That's where the real problem lies. The inconstancy of the mind is the problem. The stress caused by the mind is the problem. The mind holding on to things it shouldn't hold on to. How do you watch the mind? You get it to do something that you think is right and you watch it in action. You get it to commit, then you reflect. That's how you get past your ignorance. The Buddha's Conventions. August 14, 2021. I know of a monk who's occasionally asked to name children, and he says he doesn't like doing it because that's the beginning of social conditioning. Giving the child a name makes it have a sense of self. That attitude strikes me as strange. After all, everybody needs a name. As Ajahn Chah once said, if we just called out, person, 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 nobody would know who was being called. The Buddha himself called people by their names. He didn't call them aggregates. Aggregates come here. Aggregates go away. Rahula, he called Rahula. Sariputta, Sariputta. Siddha the elephant trainer, he called Siddha. There's nothing inherently wrong with developing a sense of self. In fact, you need one in order to function in this world. If you're not trained in a wise sense of self, you're going to pick up a sense of self willy-nilly anyhow, so you might as well learn a wise one. It's one of those assumptions that people just make, they're primed for it. The question is, how do you teach someone to develop a good one? That's what the Dhamma is all about. Examining our assumptions and asking ourselves what skillful assumptions we can adopt to question our old perceptions, to see what purposes they serve. Because every perception serves a purpose, good or bad. As when you're learning a language. In some cases, people will point things out to you and say, this is called that, and this means this. But often you simply pick up meanings by noticing how people use words. Sometimes your assumptions are wrong, and you have to adjust them later. Sometimes they work well enough that even though they may be a little off, they're okay for you because they serve your purposes. When you come to the Dhamma, the question becomes not how to get rid of your social conditioning, but what purposes do you want to serve with your conditioning? In what ways do you need to be reconditioned to serve those purposes? Because our idea of a perception that's true basically comes down to, does it work well enough? For a lot of people, their attitude toward well enough, their definition of well enough, is pretty low. The Buddha is asking you to raise it. How about if good enough was total happiness, and anything inferior to that wasn't good enough? How would you sort out your perceptions then? This is where we want to look at the Buddha's vocabulary. The way he teaches the Dhamma. One of the factors necessary for gaining stream entry, the first taste of awakening, is listening to the true Dhamma, recognizing the true Dhamma, and adopting its assumptions. In other words, the Buddha is going to condition us as to what kind of perceptions are useful, what kind of thought constructs are useful, what ways of fabricating our experience will be helpful in that direction. He teaches us how to use these things as tools, knowing that at some point we'll have to put our tools aside. It's like being taught how to make a chair. You have to learn how to use a saw properly, use a hammer properly, files, sandpaper. All kinds of tools. If you bring in an egg beater, it's not going to be useful. If you bring in a violin, it won't help. Those tools are useful for other purposes. Sometimes we have a saw already, but its blades are dull. Our hammer has been so worn through that if you hit anything with it really hard, the head would fly off and hurt somebody. In other words, we have some tools that are okay for everyday purposes, some that are dangerous. If you're going to look for true happiness, you have to be willing to inspect and replace your tools for the sake of the Dhamma. So, when you listen to the Dhamma, remember that you're asking not only, how does the Buddha describe things? But, what kind of description is he replacing? When he asks a question, what questions is he not asking? This comes under the heading of appropriate attention, how you frame things in the mind. The way you frame things, and the perceptions you use to provide the frame and then to fill the frame, will make a huge difference. Again, think about languages. Some languages have a very extensive vocabulary for emotions, others have a more scientific vocabulary. It depends on what the language has been used for. Those are the things it'll emphasize. In terms of the language of the Dhamma, you want to look at things in terms of 1. What is suffering? Where is the suffering? And then, 2. What's causing it? The Buddha recommends asking not who is causing it, but what activity. He's not saying whether there is or isn't someone behind the activity, because he wants you to look at the activity directly. If you come to the Dhamma with a very strong sense of, I'm me, and I'm the kind of person who does things this way, you have to learn how to put that assumption aside. You're putting it aside not as a bad tool, but just as a tool that's used for something else, like an egg beater. If you're making a chair, you don't want the egg beater. An egg beater might be useful for things like cakes, but it's not what you want right now. The Buddha says that suffering is clinging to the 5 aggregates. That means you need to figure out what kinds of clinging there are, what kind of aggregates there are, and the different ways you cling to the different aggregates. What kind of activity leads to the clinging? Well, there's craving. What leads to craving? Feeling. The Buddha chases these activities down, independent co-arising all the way to ignorance. When people would ask him, who's doing the feeling? He would say, don't ask. Who does the feeling belong to? Don't ask. Just look at the process of feeling, and you see it comes from contact. Contact depends on the 6 senses, and so on down the line. He's giving you a framework for looking at things simply as events and actions. The framework is not the world and it's not yourself. In fact, dependent co-arising is a framework that describes how you give rise to the concept of world based on your 6 senses, and how you give rise to a concept of self based on clinging. That way, you see where these things come from. You see the activities that give rise to them. As the Buddha said, you can focus on any one of these activities and try to understand where it's coming from, how it's causing suffering, what its allure is, why you like doing it, and then compare the allure with the drawbacks until you really see there's no worth to what you've been clinging to. The allure is often just a tiny taste. One of the Buddha's images is of a bead of honey on the blade of a knife. He's not denying that the honey is sweet. It is sweet, but it's awfully small and in an awfully dangerous place. When you see that, you let go of the activity. And in letting go of that activity, you start sending cracks up through other activities that help to loosen up, on the one hand, your sense of the world and, on the other hand, your sense of yourself. You don't attack those things directly. You attack them by looking at activities, seeing where all the things you do, desiring to find happiness, are not causing happiness. Then you ask yourself, well, why? As long as there's an effort being made, why make the effort there? What's gained? Now, if you were to place that question within the context of who you are, you might say, well, this affirms who I am. Or, this is just the way I am. Or, this is the way the world has to be. Everything gets frozen in place. But if you allow yourself to look at the action simply as an action and analyze it in those terms, as part of a process, you find yourself letting go of things that otherwise you would have held on to really tightly. So, when the Buddha gives his teachings like dependent co-arising, the Four Noble Truths, or the Three Perceptions, they're a form of social conditioning, too. This is why the forest tradition never describes them as ultimate truths. They're assumptions. They're conventions. We use the Buddha's conventions because they serve a purpose that our ordinary conventions can't. His perceptions work in a way that our ordinary perceptions don't work. This is how we test them as to whether they really are true Dhamma. Do they work? And do they work for the purpose of an end of suffering? This is why the word Dhamma is closely associated with the word Atha in Pali. Atha means meaning, purpose, benefit. The Dhamma, if it's true Dhamma, provides a benefit, serves a purpose, and that's how you test it. When you're serious about awakening and want to have a taste of the deathless, you want to test these things in this way. As the Buddha said, you want to listen to the true Dhamma from a person of integrity, one who's basically an admirable friend. The Buddha said that the true Dhamma would disappear not long after he passed away, by which he meant that other versions of Dhamma would get circulated, so that the true Dhamma's monopoly on being the Dhamma would be called into question. He said it was like counterfeit money. When counterfeit money comes into the market, real money disappears because everything becomes suspect. Before there was counterfeit, everybody trusted the money. They could use it as a medium confidently. Nobody had to ask too many questions. But once counterfeit comes in, you have to ask the questions that test. How do you recognize genuine money? What are the reliable tests? It's the same with the Dhamma. Now that there are many contradictory versions of the Dhamma, we have to make a test to see which is the true Dhamma. The Buddha taught the Kalamas a series of tests. He taught his stepmother, Gautam, plus a series of tests. He taught Upali, the Vinaya expert, a series of tests. In every case, it was, when you put this into practice, and that's what those conventions are meant for, to be put into practice, what are the results? If a teaching leads to harm, there's something wrong. It's not the genuine article. If it makes you burdensome on other people, if it gets you entangled a lot with other people, it's not the genuine article. If it leads to being unfettered, leads to dispassion, that's it. That's the Atha by which you recognize the Dhamma. So, the Buddha never said that all social conventions are bad. After all, language is a convention, and he used language to teach. Names are conventions, and he used names so that people would know who he was talking to, what he was talking about. He used the conventions of the aggregates, the sense media, and the properties to get you to look at what was going on in your experience, not in terms of who you are, although it starts out with who you are, but you begin to realize that your sense of who you are is an action. There are times when it's a skillful sense of self, and other times when it's not. Learn to see your different senses of self as perceptions, as activities. Then class them as to whether they're skillful or unskillful activities. Thinking this way loosens up your perceptions, so you start looking more and more directly at actions and their results. This is how you can pry apart your attachments and your clinging in a way that's in line with the Buddha's sense of what's good enough. He said he never let himself rest content with skillful qualities until he found the real thing. And that's the attitude he's asking you to adopt, too. In harmony with the Buddha's teachings, we stress the profound importance of sharing wisdom widely. We've converted this extensive 1,000-page work into an audio format, and the responsibility to advance this noble cause now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you assume a pivotal role in the extensive distribution of these teachings, which can enrich the lives of countless others. Let's carry forward the timeless tradition of spreading knowledge and nurturing mindfulness for the betterment of humanity. We extend a wholehearted invitation for you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can make a profound and positive impact on the lives of many.